on Author Meets Critic for the Network C, which is Gender, Work, and Family. And we have a presentation of a book which is very appropriate, as you can see. It is a research handbook on work-life balance, emerging issues, and methodological challenges. So what we're going to do is we're going to have, first of all, a presentation by the two editors, that is Sonia Bertolini and Barbara Poggio. Yes. And then we will have Kadri Taht, who will also present. She's author of a chapter of the book. And we have some people online also, Barbara Rizman, Anna Barrett, and Manuele Maldini. So the two first ones are from the US, and Manuela is from the University of Turin. So these people will also give a short presentation on the chapter, and then the floor is open, and we invite you to make comments, ask questions, and everything. So the floor is to you, first of all, to have a presentation of the book.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon. And I'd like to thank you, Diane-Gabrielle, but also the Network Gender Working Family of SASE and Bernard Fusulier too, for this opportunity of being here today with Sonia Bertolini and some of the authors who took part in this almost ambitious and maybe reckless editorial adventure of writing a research handbook on work-life balance. And I like to start just from the title, as I like to avoid generating possible misunderstandings or excessive expectations. So I would like to clarify from the beginning that our book is certainly not an exhaustive compendium of research on work-life balance. That honestly would be a mission impossible given the huge body of contributions and perspective already existing in the literature. Rather, no, I don't. Okay, it's okay. Rather, our aim was more circumscribed. It was to offer some theoretical reflections and several examples of empirical research in order to illustrate the multiple strategies, mainly from a sociological perspective, because there are several perspectives too who work on work-life balance. Through which to illustrate the multiple strategy, to study the intersections between working life and other articulation and trajectories of the biographical experiences of individual, with a particular focus on family ones. When we embarked in this adventure, we were aware of the many pitfalls, starting from the ambiguities and the criticalities about the concept of work-life balance, especially in the light of the transformations or the more or less recent past, from the ongoing redefinition of family structures and roles to the higher life expectancy, the weakening of the welfare system, the individualization, fragmentation, and precarization of the life and work experiences, the digitalization of work and the redefinition of workplaces, and other different processes that led to a progressive dissolution of the boundaries between these domains. And but what didn't anticipate when we started planning the handbook was the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, which happened right during the writing of the book. And it was an experience with a very hard impact on everyone's lives, including our own, the authors, particularly on the ways of working and managing personal and family relationships and commitments, and which at least in part urged us to redefine our analytical and interpretative frameworks. In this presentation, Sonia Bertolini and I will briefly outline the theoretical and methodological framework of the book, and then we'll try to go more in detail about the contents with the help of some of the contributors. As Diane-Gabrielle already said, there will be Barbara Riesman and Barrett Manuel-Aldini online, and Kadri and Marge here in presence. And I would like to thank all of them for so generously accepting our invitation on Saturday for people using holidays in this day. First of all, the first thing I want to do is to present shortly the structure of the volume in order to give you a general idea of the frame. And overall, the handbook is articulated in 5 sections. In the first one, Sonia Bertolini and I, together with other colleagues, try to define the theoretical and methodological framework of the book, to which we will return after. And the second section includes 3 contributions that reflect on the opportunity of adopting multi-level research approaches and perspectives along the gender and the temporal axis. In particular, Barbara Riesman and Emily Holgren stresses the importance of a multi-level analytical approach within a gender structure theory, as Barbara Riesman herself, she developed this theory, will tell us better in a little while. In the third chapter, Jean Ganot and Rampayet highlight how work-life balance research has been predominantly cross-sectional, and they suggest the opportunity to adopt a life course standpoint in order to offer a dynamic conceptualization of work-life balance issues and to better capture the ongoing transformations. The third chapter, written by Anne Barrett, together with Rachel Douglas and Jessica Noblit, that will be after presented by Anne Barrett herself, offers an almost unusual temporal perspective focused on the work-life balance experience of the second half of life. Then there are 4 sections dedicated to several empirical contributions focused on different topics and targets, from childcare to fatherhood to pregnancy to self-employment and so on, and based on different perspectives, mainly macro, meso, and micro, and different methodologies. Sonia will tell you more about them and the research articulation. I only briefly anticipate the main contents of the section. Comparative research based on quantitative methods is at the heart of the part 3, while the third part is focused on qualitative approaches based on longitudinal, discursive, and narrative perspectives. The fifth part includes chapters that use mixed and multi-method research. And finally, part 6 is dedicated to research contribution based on innovative research and methodologies, and particularly digital and visual ones. Okay, so this is the general structure. And I would like to spend the remaining time to say something about the theoretical frame of the book, presented in a chapter written with Anna Carreri and Elisa Dordoni. And here we try to introduce the scientific debate on work-life balance, starting from a summary reconstruction of the development of the concept, from the emphasis on the conflict between the separate sphere, actually already criticized by the first author to use it, from Roosevelt Moscanter to Joseph Black, and to coming to the more recent urges to abandon it because of its many limitations and biases. Among these weaknesses, the fact that this is a construct designed in particular in relation to the women's experience that reinforces the traditional model of division of labor based on the Fordist ideology, and also a traditional view of family with a clear gender division of roles. This is the reason why many alternative formulas emerging during the time in the debate, from that of work-family enrichment to the work-family enhancement, they try to reflect on how work and family can also enrich and complement each other, and on how taking on multiple roles can develop useful skills for both women and men, improving well-being and the quality of their social life, to work-family boundaries with a focus on the fit between effective boundary practices and those desired by individuals, and also their directionality to understand whether subjects tend to integrate or separate their life spheres until the constructor harmonization, more focus on the sharing of the task in the couple, or work-life justice that explore complex intersectionality issue and shift the onus of finding harmony between career and home from the individual to the societies. More in general, what is more urgent is that we need to adopt more explicitly multidimensional interpretative keys, able to account for the complexity and the growing fluidity of the phenomenon. And we need to consider it, taking into account the interweaving of multiple axes. This is the reason why in the chapter we try to outline the main thematic axis around which the debate on work-life balance has developed, such as gender and generation, but also those that should be better considered, for example, class, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, and so on. In general, what we have to do is adopt an intersectional approach in the analysis of the relationship between work and other spheres of life. Finally, we try to identify some of the main challenges also in the light of the ongoing transformation and the implication posed by the pandemic, in order to identify the possible trajectories and perspectives opening up for future agendas. In particular, if we think the pandemic, and if we think that it always happens with catastrophes, it acted as a sort of magnifying glass, bringing to light contradictions and social imbalances that were already present, but not so visible, and taking them to the extreme. And as soon as many people found themselves confined within their domestic walls, it became evident, it became clear how an analytic construct based on the existence of two distinct domains, paid work on the one hand and private life on the other, had become intrinsically problematic and insufficient on the heuristic level. In this dramatic scenario really appear more complex and indefinite than what the construct of work-life balance allows us to guess. And the intertwining between its domain became more and more nuanced, differentiated, and located in relation to different dimensions, from socio-economic to temporal and spatial ones. Again, the technology play a key role in this picture, especially with digital devices that intensify the processes of work flexibilization. On this side, the pandemic has acted as an extremely powerful accelerator of the process. The number of people engaged in virtual work has increased in an exponential way, but the condition that characterize the work-life balance in this specific context, school and daycare facilities closed, a continuous work-life a continuous work from home for the whole of the week, without a clear definition of time and spaces, and without a specific and dedicated spaces and facilities in that specific training. Also the present, all the family at home and so on, many other aspects. All these aspects were actually rather different from those that could make remote work a resource for work-life balance. And in this global experiment, we could see boundaries between workplace and home, therefore becoming increasingly permeable and flexible, both on a physical and temporal level, with consequences that affected and affect worker quality of life and the room for reconciliation too. Not to mention all the subsequent consequences in terms of job losses and unemployment that have mainly, as we know, has mainly affected the employment condition of women. And on the basis of all these considerations, we close our first chapter by wondering what are the main implications for those who are going to study what we have long defined work-life balance on an interpretative perspective. And to summarize, we think it is more and more important to adopt a more explicitly multidimensional approach, able to account for the complexity of the phenomenon, leaving behind a binary perspective, to keep a gender perspective, but integrated and enriched by the inclusion of other dimensions of diversity, to dedicate greater consideration to the transformation of work, particularly to the processes of precariousness, fragmentation, and individualization, and to focus on technological changes and their implication in terms of progressive hybridization among domains, spaces, and times of life. Obviously, all these has relevant implication, the research methodologies and strategies. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Sonia Bertolini that will tell us more about this.
Thank you, Barbara. I will be very briefly for give the floor to the moderator and to the other speakers, but just I would like to underline that in our handbook, we focus mainly, especially on methodology to study work-life balance. And in this, we asked the authors to focus on this, and there is also chapter 2 written by Rosie Mesumeci and me that it is about methodology to study work-life balance. Especially, we try to focus on the relationship between methodology and theoretical framework. The idea is to reflect about the methodological choices that depend on the research question and the conceptual tools that we use, and vice versa. So, in the chapters, you will find a variety of methodologies to study work-life balance. In particular, a reflection on which methods have been used until now to study this concept. In particular, in our chapter, we underline that mainly quantitative studies have been done concerning this topic, and that a lot of contribution consider only one of the level, the micro, the meso, or the macro level, and so the individual level, the organizational level, or the macro level. And it's very interesting because in papers in which, or articles in which, you can find the links between levels. For example, how the macro level, the national institutional context, the regulation, the culture can conditionate the decision making of men and women when they have to commit themselves to everyday life. Which are the limit of the using of the methodology in studying work-life balance? Looking at the literature, we saw that mainly they are focused on the micro individual levels, even if recently research extended to the meso and micro levels. And looking at the samples, what we found that there is more literature, more surveys studying working mothers with children from middle class in couple and dual learner couples, but some other group of people has been less studied, marginalized, like working fathers with children or families with low social capital. In some way, studying more the mother with children led to the reproduction of the idea that care is female. So it's important, we think that in the future studies, it's very important first to reconnect the different level of analysis, even because the work-life balance is becoming a very complex phenomenon. And so this is the first point. Second point is very important to include in the samples father or even focus on single adult workers without children. Very important to develop comparative approaches, both quantitative and qualitative, and to develop innovative approaches and methodologies. At this regard, the pandemic situation accelerated this kind of studies using, for example, digital studies or this kind of methodology, and using mixed method approaches. At this regard, I just say something, but what is mixed method approach is it means to combine different sources of data, sometimes qualitative and quantitative data, and because different kind of data can emerge using different methodologies, studying the same research questions. At this regard, sorry, but I can move. No. At this regard, in the book, I will end the book saying that in the book we have a lot of chapters using different kind of methodology. In particular, in the majority of contribution, authors use multi-method or mixed method analysis. So they combine surveys. You can see the list. I don't go through all, but they combine, for example, survey and interviews. So they combine with different kind of visual methodology with narrative methodologies, or they combine different narrative analysis. I can just show. Or you can find chapters in which has been used the longitudinal qualitative methodologies that is used to study work-life conflict through a life course approaches. At this regard, we have Manuela Naldini, so she will say more about this. This methodology allows us to observe variation in the behavior and in values in different phases of the life courses. Finally, I underline that we have also some quantitative comparative chapters, and we have also some chapters that combine digital methodology with interviews, or that use new kind of ethnography, like distant netography, that apply ethnography using the internet communities. Then I will leave the floor to the moderator.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to thank you, the moderator, and the discussant to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I actually forgot to didn't bring the right paper. So we'll go on to some very short presentations. I hope it's okay for the sound. Can you hear us? I think it's Barbara Riesman who should be presenting, and then Anne and Manuel.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to take my very short 7 minutes to make really just two major points. The first point I want to make is that when you think about work-life balance or issues, that this is a fundamentally gendered question. And I'm going to say a few words about why that is the case. And then I'm going to suggest that once that you accept that premise, that it's useful to use gender structure theory to understand, organize, and analyze the research that is already out there about the topic. So let me start with why the whole topic really needs to be framed when we think about it by gender theory. And that's because the very fact that we're thinking of work and life in this way is because of the history of modernization and industrialization. That is, when work left the family, left the home setting, paid work came to be coded as male, and family work, life, if you will, came to be coded as female. And so at least a big part of the very problem we have now with work-life balance is because despite this history, women, of course, have moved into the paid public sphere in mass numbers and have for decades now all over the world. But men have not equally moved into responsibility and labor in the private sphere, in the family, the work of doing life. And so at least a big part of this work-life balance issue is because women are doing work that is coded as male, and men are much less likely to be doing work that's coded as female, that is caring work. And so that really underlies the notion that work-family balance and the problems we have with it are really fundamentally tied to gender and gender inequality. And so I think that's what that's my major argument here. And once we think about work-life balance as being a problem of gender inequality, one way to move forward is to think, okay, so how does gender operate in this setting? And as you've already seen in the introduction, we can think about this at the three levels: at the individual, the interactional, or the meso, and the macro, both the logic of how we legitimize our social systems and also the rules and regulations for how we distribute goods and services. What I'm adding, I hope, to this conversation of those three levels is that each of those levels, we need to think both about culture and meaning, and we also have to think about the materiality of touch and feel and distribution of goods and services. And so using that kind of a perspective, I just want to talk a little and very briefly about how the research about work-life balance shows us the way inequality and gender inequality in particular operates, but in some ways is also, there's some good stories in here, some progress in the research about the topic. At the individual level, we know that even today, the most recent research, young women still choose and think about their paid work, their careers, their outside, in terms of what will eventually be family responsibilities in motherhood long before they're married, long before they're mothers. That we still raise boys and girls differently in order to think about how they're going to have to balance work and family. And I think that's really the sort of cultural dimension. We can't lose sight of that. And of course, in a more material dimension, once women are in the labor force, very few of our workplaces provide a lot of support for the time that one needs to breastfeed and the differential use of bodies for people who give birth and breastfeed and those that don't. At the interactional level, we still have very different expectations of what makes a good mother, good wife, good husband, or good father. And so in families, we have those expectations, but we also have them at the workplace, so that a good worker still is, and maybe even more now than ever, with our 24/7, you can work all the time because your work is on your desk. A good worker doesn't let anything interfere with work. And so that even when we have possibilities for time off, for caring, there's a flexibility stigma, the research shows us. That people, particularly men, but sometimes women, are afraid to use the policies we have because of the bias that we still hold for using them. And at the macro level, I think at the way organizations operate, I think that COVID in some senses has made our institutions even more greedy of our time, because the flexibility is great, but if you're expected to be always available, that makes it even harder for caregivers. And of course, the motherhood penalty, we have lots of research shows that motherhood brings wage penalties to women, and fatherhood actually brings benefits to men. And so I think I just want to conclude by suggesting that we really can't talk about or solve the issues of workplace balance and incompatibility without tackling gender inequality, because workplace and family issues are really feminist issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just make one little comment. It's quite interesting to see from a language point of view. I mean, we're all speaking different languages here, and you were discussing the terminology, conflict, etc. For me, from Quebec and from the Francophone world, we don't use balance so much, and that was also discussed in your book. I found that interesting. We've actually, in the Francophone world, really have left what would be a literal translation, équilibre, because basically, exactly, that balance is not attained. So here, of course, we tend to look more to words like reconciliation, integration, in French, articulation, conciliation, which indicates there's a movement towards something which we might someday finally attain, as you indicated. And of course, I think, speaking from the US, I was just at the Work and Family Research Network last week, and I think we need to mention that, unfortunately, the US is probably, amongst industrialized nations, one of the ones where the state supports women the less, so therefore businesses. So anyhow, I won't go into that more, but it is clear that in terms of maternity leave and of course paternity leave, they're definitely very far from that. So we'll have another presentation from Anne Barrett, I think. Now you can go ahead also for a little 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you to Barbara and Sonia for including me in the book project and in this event. Although I'm a sociologist, like many or most all the other contributors, my research focuses a bit different. Gender figures into much of my work, but primarily I'm a sociologist of age. I see age as a construct that occupies a curious position in our discipline. It's omnipresent, but theoretically underdeveloped. The way we tend to treat age in our discipline across its many facets is either as a control variable or an indicator of life course position. And this approach really aligns the aspect of age that's most relevant to sociology. That is, its operation as a system of inequality that shares much with other such systems like gender. I've been interested in theoretically developing the notion of age as an inequality. This project for me is motivated by an interest in infusing age into all substantive branches of the field. I really aim to promote more age-centered sociological research and to move this work from its margin in our discipline to its rightful place alongside other inequalities at the center. So given these interests, I very much appreciated the opportunity to survey the literature on work-life balance, filter it through an age lens, and point to some possible research directions that are revealed by this perspective. And I did this with a couple of graduate students at FSU, Jessica Noblet and Rachel Douglas. Our chapter begins with a description of what our survey of the literature revealed. It confirmed our expectation. Studies do tend to focus on the challenges confronting employed parents of young children, with few examining those faced by older adults. While it's true that some of these findings may extrapolate to the second half of life, others may not. Perhaps most notably, middle-aged and older adults, especially women, are doing other types of care work, namely caring for older family members, spouses, or partners, and grandchildren, activities that are less often addressed by private or public policies. We argue in our chapter that the aging of the world's population underscores the importance of considering work-life balance in later life. Population aging is driven by two demographic trends: shrinking family size and increasing life expectancy. Together, these patterns yield decades of life, extending beyond the care of our fewer young children, during which people are seeking work-life balance. Paid work is a central activity across many of these years. This reality is made possible by improvements in health across cohorts and encouraged by policies aimed at reducing pension payouts. These decades of life, however, are not spent only in employment, but of course, retired or perhaps disabled. The World Health Organization estimates that life expectancy at birth globally averages 71, while a healthy life expectancy, that is the number of years free of disease and disability, averages 62. These figures suggest that the work-life balance equation changes in middle and later life as health declines create new demands on time and energy. This issue, however, has received limited attention in the work-life balance literature, given its focus on younger, presumably healthy, working-age adults. Colliding with these demographic and health trends are economic ones that further shape work-life balance in later life. While the expansion of life expectancy and postponement of disability create new possibilities for achieving work-life balance across adulthood, economic trends restrict such options for many people. Rising income inequality has intensified the pressure to remain in the paid labor force, bolstered by neoliberal political economies that emphasize individual rather than state responsibility for populace well-being. In addition to these economic pressures are moral ones generated by the current emphasis on so-called productive aging that views additional years of life as an economic resource not to be squandered. We argue that these demographic, economic, and political shifts point to a need for researchers to give greater attention to work-life balance issues in middle and later life. So our chapter addresses three issues raised by shifting the temporal frame on work-life balance to middle and later life. First, we take a longer range view of the effects of work-life balance. We observe that studies tend to consider relatively short time spans, so little is known about the effect of work-life balance on people's well-being physical, psychological, or social, across their often 3 to 5 decades of paid labor force. Next, our chapter addresses research directions that are raised by the issue of balancing care work for older family members, spouses or partners, and grandchildren. The limited attention in this literature to this type of care work is surprising, given its prevalence, intensity, and its duration. But most people do it at some point in their lives, often for years, and often in combination with paid work. One of the research directions we suggest centers on an examination of the similarities and differences in caring for children versus older adults. While sharing some challenges and rewards, they differ in ways that limit the extrapolation of much of the work-life balance literature to later life. Care for older family members can be on a day-to-day basis more intense, less predictable, and last longer in the life course than was planned. An even more fundamental difference, however, stems from sociocultural constructions of these two life stages during which care needs are greatest, at life's beginning and its end. The much more positive view of infancy and childhood than deep old age, when daily care needs arise, is reflected in the conditions encountered by care providers at each stage. The transition to parenthood is often a highly anticipated, visible, and celebrated one, accompanied by advice and support from family members and friends, and workplace and state policies to some degree to accommodate such care work. In contrast, acquiring the role of a care provider for an older family member is not marked by celebration. Rather, it's entered with some degree of apprehension and is rarely facilitated by workplace or state policies. This is invisible work performed by the shadow workforce. The last set of research questions we discuss in our chapter centers on leisure, a domain receiving limited attention in this literature. Leisure is brought into focus, however, by employing an aging lens, as later life is often viewed in Western cultures as devoted to its pursuit, though far from universally experienced as such. In the few studies examining leisure, it's viewed as a health-related behavior, much like alcohol consumption, smoking, and sleep. But this framing treats leisure as a consequence of work, namely as something that's constrained by it, rather than exploring the more nuanced interconnections between these domains that involve preferences and meanings that shift across the life course and change over historical time. In sum, we argue that motivating research on these issues, or the many others raised by a sociology of age perspective, would not only enrich conceptual and theoretical underpinnings of work-life balance, but also illuminate individuals' experiences across their increasingly longer lives. So thank you again for your interest and your attention.
Thank you. So very interesting addition here, particularly interesting since also in Quebec we've been starting to work quite a lot on care. And personally, I think you mentioned, you were mentioning middle life and later life, and I think definitely we have to look throughout the full life course because the challenges are clearly quite different. In Quebec and Canada, we find in the data about 58% of women do caring or are responsible for caring responsibilities, 42% of men, but what the men do is quite different, usually transportation, finance, etc. So it doesn't interfere with their employment as much. So yeah, I can only support this perspective of adding the age perspective. So thanks a lot. Now we go on to Manuela Naldini. I think she's also online.
Yes, I am here.
Great, and you have appeared just as we mentioned your name, so that's perfect.
Okay, so the chapter I am going to present is titled Longitudinal Qualitative Research for studying work-family balance before and after childbirth. So thank you very much to Barbara and Sonia for guesting me in their very interesting and nice book that we are going to present today. Some premise to start, I could say that, of course, studying the transition to parenthood and the first time becoming parent is very important from the point of view of work-life balance, especially because after the arrival of the first child, it started a period in which work-life reconciliation should become a challenge for parents. At the same time, there have been an increase in longitudinal qualitative research and a more available and fruitful area of research to understand the changes and the persistence, especially with regard to what was saying also Barbara Riesman, the gender inequality and the gender separate sphere in the life course perspective. So the study that was involved in the chapter is part of a wider research project that involved a multidisciplinary team, but it was mainly managed by a researcher, and it was done by the University of Turin, and was focused on transition to parenthood of dual learner couple in order to understand the way in which female and male gender model are done or undone in the daily life. So the focus, as I said, is a dual learner couple. So with high level of education, this is a limitation, as Sonia was mentioning. We were studying the changes in expectation behavior of parents to be and of new parents with babies. Why I say that? I say that because the study has been relying on 88 longitudinal in-depth interviews that have been done with 22 dual learner couple. The couple have been interviewed twice before the arrival of the first chapter and then after 1 year and a half of the children. And the partner were interviewed separately. So what I am going to do in this brief time that I have is to try to make some reflection of the importance of using a theoretical framework and of the methodological reflection about the challenging of this kind of study, that means longitudinal qualitative studies. So from a theoretical perspective in this study, I am using and blending the approach of life course perspective with the emphasis on in the importance of time, change and continuity within individual, but also looking at the interrelationship of individual with other career and family experience. In particular, in our cases, we look not at the individual, but to the couple. We interview separately him and her before and after the child arrival. Then we use a gender approach, of course, to understand better the changes and the continuity in this work-life balance with the arrival of a child, using very much authors and an integrative approach that also Barbara Riesman was mentioning before. We, as mentioned, her and her colleague work very much in the chapter. So here there is an example of how analytically we were working with this material that we have been collecting and then analyzing, a lot of interviews and very complex one. Here we mentioned, for instance, how we analyze the changes over time in a before, we could say, and after approach, which emphasizes the differences between then and now. Specifically here in this scheme, the framework applies to childcare strategies and gender practices that the couple has put in place before as planned, and then they have put in place. And we are looking here if there are some gap between before and after, and which are the dynamic of the changes and why it happened and how. So we focus also on the mechanism at the couple and institutional level that we're explaining to some extent the persistence of gender inequalities in the couple and in family in these cases. Of course, I have no time for mentioning the main findings, but I would like to spend my last few minutes on some reflection about the potentiality and the pitfalls of the qualitative longitudinal study. There have been several potentiality of this kind of studies, methodologically speaking. First of all, for instance, in our case, this was the first longitudinal qualitative studies on transition to parenthood in Italy, and it helped us exactly to settle out the couple account in a context. It has a lot of important dimensions that help us to see women and men in action in the midst of the change when the child is arriving, of course. And it has also the research team, because this study has been done by a research team, could use a lot of flexibility and innovation, also in terms of methodology and intersubjectivity, and we had a lot of learning opportunity. However, we know that there are several pitfalls in using this longitudinal qualitative data. First of all, because there is a large investment in time, of course, in money, because it's difficult to maintain the contact with especially in this case, with a couple both. We had to add the approval of both of the person after 1 year and a half. And there is, of course, a lot of participation attrition. But specifically, I would like to conclude to mention two general issues that were arising from this research. If we look at the theoretical and methodological aspects. The first one is the complexity and the multidimensionality of studying this issue. The complexity is not only collecting data because of couples, because of couple before and after, but is in analyzing this data. Handling this data is a complex task. And sometimes we see that is a sort of data that cannot end less in terms of what we found out. And in terms of also saturation, there is a sort of absence of analytical closure that can be worrying. And then I would like also to underline that there are also some opportunity. For instance, the second important issue that arises from this chapter is that it is important to understand how to foster conceptual and theoretical development that maybe can open up a new opportunity for methodological innovation, as we were mentioning our editor at the beginning, and also in cross-national or cross-border comparison of couple interview data from different institutional contexts. And in this perspective, discussing the methodological and analytical issue involved in qualitative longitudinal interview probably bring us back to the need to understand social change as contextual and as multifaceted, as were said also the colleague at the beginning of that. So thank you very much for the time and for organizing this interesting presentation of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuela. So we'll have the last presentation of a person from the book, that is from Kadri Taht.
Yes. My name is Kadri Taht and I'm from Tallinn University, Estonia. And I'm gonna present shortly just one chapter what was on work-life balance from the childcare perspective. Although this paper has been classified more like a methodological contribution, I focus here more on the content, and the methodological part maybe just a little. We used mixed method terms of, as already pointed out, Sonia, that we used quantitative data, more precisely time use data, which allowed us to look at the time use within the household, and trying to innovate a little bit. That we look at the time use, time used for the care of children by the parents, but also by the grandparents if they were in the household. Because when we talk about childcare, and especially in context of work-life balance, the focus is often on the formal care arrangements, and this is what we desire to help parents, especially women, to work more, spend more hours in the labor market, right? But there is still informal care, which is very important, and we try to control in our models also the informal care, which is not received externally, but also internally from the house. And then we complemented the study with the qualitative part, because we could see that there is higher risk of accumulation of this disadvantage of not being able to arrange the care, and there is risk of accumulation, especially in the families or households where where the parents are anyway in a higher risk of labor market exclusion, and especially often because of the work, because they work non-standard hours, in the weekends, in the service sector, and the formal care arrangements are usually arranged according to formal or normal hours, so during the day hours. Just make it too long. The study was about Estonia, and just a few words about the Estonian case. Estonia has a very high labor market participation rate, especially women, before having children, after having children. The most women who even withdraw from the labor market temporarily due to childcare return there later. We have a very generous paid parental leave, which allows for parents, but in practice it's mostly mothers, to stay out of the labor market for a year and a half per child after it's born, to get full salary of the previous earnings of the pre-child. And as of age year and a half, the children are entitled to public childcare for a reasonable price. But the practice, of course, is that there is not enough places, so there is kind of a care gap between year and a half and 3. So by age 3, most of the children are so-called full-time in the childcare, so they have long days, 5 days a week. As you can see, looking at from time use or time use perspective, when the child is born, all the mothers basically withdraw from the labor market, and in 3 years they kind of recover their employment. For the fathers, you see a nice flat line. Their time use doesn't change with the arrival of a child.
Isn't that surprising?
So, but it's still often a bit shocking to see it so clear, right, on the charts. And then you can see that the mothers' return to labor market goes in parallel with the use of childcare, especially the formal childcare. So by age of child, as I said, most of the kids end up in the childcare. But there is still informal childcare parallel or next to it, quite present, which indicates that, of course, one hand, grandparents or family members want to spend time with the children. It's not always maybe need-based, but still, as we can see later in the data, that probably still needed also for those families. So when we look at how the use of the child care facilities, formal and informal, affects labor market participation, So the first column is for unemployment, how is unemployment is affected, and we don't see any association. So having children in childcare or being unemployed doesn't relate to use of childcare. So it's not that they're unemployed and children stay home; they still keep going to the care. But inactivity is very much affected. Despite the fact that it's very institutionalized, this time of being home, taking care of children and mostly mothers, and later returning to the labor market, having secured the place of in the childcare facility. So that even after we control for formal childcare, which is quite extensive and quite many hours the kids spend in kindergartens, still having informal childcare reduces the chances of inactivity, meaning that having the good coverage of the formal care still leaves some people in the need of informal care. And we also can see that the formal and here is informal care arrangement affect men and women differently. For men, is often see also here like sliding line of flat lines, and for women especially who are dependent on the care of the formal but also informal care. So the grandparents living in the household help women to participate in the labor market. As I already said in the beginning, when looking at this data and who is also using more this informal care and grandparent care, we could see that there is higher risk really for example, younger people who are in more insecure labor market position to have this challenge of how to combine work and care, especially given the jobs that they're often working, like you're working in the service sector in the weekends, and there is no formal care available. And in the qualitative interviews, we really could see this problem or this challenge also indicated by families. Really very kind of hard stories how in the morning you had to choose that one bus takes you to the work and the other takes you to bring your child to the childcare, and you have to really choose where to go because you cannot do both things. Or people moving in with the grandparents, taking care of the grandparents so that grandparents can take care of the children in the night. So you go to work, for example, in the gas station. So, and of course, there is a clear gender difference that if I would have left men out from this analysis, the findings would have not changed much. You can see that there's nice flat lines for the men and the stories of the women, as has been already pointed out also. Okay, that's, I think I leave it here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've had a very good overview of the book, different chapters and everything. I won't take too much time. I think it would be nice if you react to the chapters, to the presentations. You can add other elements on your own countries, for example, and comment. There's microphones up here that you don't have to pick up. They pick up the sound very well, but just make sure that you're speaking loud enough so that the people who are online can hear us. Just a little comment on the last presentation, I found that very interesting. This year and a half of maternity leave, I know there's a lot of debates on leaves because the longer, it can appear very nice to have a longer leave, but the longer leave for the mother, there's a lot of discussion in terms of how that can end up for a lot of women into a poverty trap. In Canada also, we had this discussion where the leave was 12 months. And in Quebec, we wanted, Francophone part, we wanted to have our own regime and to introduce a paternity leave, to have fathers get involved. And there was a big discussion and a lot of women's groups in the rest of Canada were saying, well, we would like to have the same program as in Quebec, where the fathers have some time reserved for them, as in the Nordic countries, because that seems to be the best way, to have reserved time, well paid, etc. Well, unfortunately, the Canadian government went another way. They said, if the father takes part of the parental leave, which is will extend actually the leave to some 18 months. And if the father takes some time, well, you know, there's more time, but it doesn't really change the basics. And on the contrary, the risk is that the woman, and that's what we were saying, the woman will have more time. There's a risk they stay out of the labor market, they have another kid, they stay even longer. And I remember in France, there was the same discussion with the PAGE, Programme d'aide aux jeunes enfants or something like that. And so, as you were saying also, there's a problem with childcare from 1.5 to 3. So basically, the women end up being out of the labor market for 3 years. And I think that's the big challenge, especially as we were discussing a little bit wage issues, inequality. Obviously, you're out of the labor market for 3 years now. And if you extend with a second child, 5 or 6 years, well, I think that's one of the elements, I think, on which the state, that I think we were all mentioning, the role of the state, where the state really has to intervene, otherwise clearly inequalities increase. Then what I found also interesting, a little bit in the book, maybe not, it was not so present, but the role of the employer. I think there's the state and there's the employer. And tomorrow morning, actually, in the same network, we're going to have some presentations on the impact of COVID. And for example, for us in Quebec, we did see that the employers did have an impact, obviously, if they accept working from home, if they are supportive or if they are not supportive. And I think we know that in the US, we have our two presenters from the US, there's a lot of work that has been done on the importance of organizational support as an important variable. So I won't go on too much. If you want to indicate, you know, if you have questions. I found the book really interesting, and I think we've heard about this just now. The introduction of the life course perspective for me is really something important. The intersectionality, taking into account gender, social class. It's true that it's not that often taken into account. Low wage earners, obviously, are less studied maybe than professional groups or bureaucracies or the public sector. The mixed method is a challenge. I think we tend to do more and more. There was a lot of quantitative, especially in the US and in psychology, I would say. Whereas in sociology, a lot more qualitative, interviews, etc. And over the years, and in management or human resources management or industrial relations, I think we've tended to do maybe more mixed methods, quanti, quali, and also look at the role of different actors. And here, actually, even in Quebec, we tended to say in one book that was on parental leave in different countries, we showed how the actor, the union as an actor, which is not, apparently, at least my French colleagues say that in Europe or in France in particular, the unions often consider that working conditions are there, you know, that's where they intervene, but work family is not for them. Whereas obviously, I don't know, there's kind of a big link between the two. And in Quebec, we tend to think that the fact that unions or the women's committee within the unions were working with a lot of women's community groups. So I tend to, well, that was my chapter. I tend to think that the fact that all these groups were brought together and pushed forward this agenda. Well, the state at one point said, yes, okay, yeah, I do have to create some daycare. I do have to maybe change the parental leave. So I think that's something to think about. The different actors, the state, the employer, but also the unions. Do they push or do they just say, no, it's not our business? So that's something interesting to think about. And the last thing I would mention is in the book also, there was this issue of conflict that you mentioned. And I think the Anglophone literature has very much put forward this terminology. Conflict, well, Anglophone and maybe more in psychology as well, and in human resources management, but basically psychologists who are in that sector, put very much the accent on conflict. And as you mentioned, after that, some people did mention enrichment or enhancement, which I find is definitely interesting, because at one point, measuring, the impact, the conflict, family on work, work on family. I mean, there were a lot of studies measuring this. And at one point you say, okay, once we've measured, let's do something about it, and whether it's one way or the other. And it seemed that it was more actually worked into family. Family was not so much interfering with work, but in most cases at least. So I think it's interesting that we move forward towards enrichment, enhancement. And then actually, I know there was a lot of research done on work-family balance measures. What is offered? A lot of work and saying, okay, these companies offer this type of company. We had observed that not-for-profits and social economy firms, for example, were offering more, sometimes informal, but more measures to a certain extent. And the interpretation was, well, possibly because as they can't pay very good wages, they can do that. And we also find it, I actually consider even that for small businesses, work-life measures are actually something which gives them a competitive advantage, which they don't have on wages. So now, in a context of labor shortage, for example, in many countries, post-pandemic, I think the message to these firms is to say, okay, if you can't pay very good wages, as large firms do, well, why don't you do something on work life? It doesn't cost much. Usually the message I tend to say is it doesn't cost much. I mean, introducing telework, they were against it before, they did it. Workers managed to do it and to be productive, and it functioned very well. So I think one of the messages interesting is, okay, well, let's put forward measures. And I'll just mention some research that we did with Bernard Fusulier, who's my co-organizer, absent here, but co-organizer in terms of organizing all the program. We started to work with specific professional categories, nurses, lawyers. I worked on accountants as well. And for example, I worked with the Bar Association, lawyers, and also with the Professional Order of Accountants. And they wanted us to suggest, something to help them out and make it easier for women lawyers and even men lawyers as well. And at one point I was, putting forward ideas. For example, lawyers tend to consider their client. It's really the client actually that's making work-life balance or reconciliation difficult for them, because the employer says, well, if you want to be an associate, you have to put in so many billable hours. But it's your choice. You can do it or you cannot do it. So it's the client, and the individual lawyers tend to consider that their client is very important. And so I had said to them, well, why don't you work more in teams? You share it. Oh, no, my client. So it's interesting. And what we were putting forward with Bernard is the professional ethos in certain sectors. And I actually found this even with nurses, they're not considered like professionals, but also it's the caring dimension. They came into that profession to care for people. And so, social workers, basically the same thing. They won't, they'll go over their hours in order to take care of the people. And so again, I think it's professional ethos. So I think this maybe one element that I would add to the discussion. Once we've gone over, okay, there's measures, firms and companies are offering measures, states are offering parental leave, etc. But sometimes, and maybe there was a reference to that a little bit before, I don't know in whose presentation, but the fact that, we want to do our best, we want to give the time, and also the technology. I think, you mentioned the technology, how that makes it possible to do longer hours. So in any case, I found the book really interesting, went through it in the last few weeks, and I think it's a very, very interesting contribution to, where we are. I think once in a while we kind of have to stop and look at what have we done? And, and to, as you do, say, well, okay, in the future now, we need to have more mixed methods. We need to have more of a life course perspective. We need to look at a diversity of individuals and situations. So I think it's a very good book to invite us to do that. Waiting for the hands, great. Go ahead.
There is also one in the Zoom.
Okay, David. Okay, so we'll go to you, David, right after we have this person. You can come up here.
Is it fine here? Or
yes, it's fine. The microphone, yours.
I am Michelle Sachs-Kelsel. I'm a legal academic. So self-confessed lawyer,
Okay.
but understand the client billable hours. That was one of the reasons I left law practice. Anyway, yeah, I have a question for Brisbane. I'm sorry, I don't know your real name, but the person who was speaking about gender, Barbara Risman. Thank you very much for your intervention. I found that really interesting, and I agree with you that I think it's a very gendered issue. One of the things economists have discussed is incorporating non-paid work into GDP. So in other words, gross domestic product is essentially, as we know, the value of goods and services exchanged within the nation's monetized economy. One shift that Kate Rayworth, for example, who discusses donut economics, is suggesting is to take into account the value of goods and services that contribute to the well-being that fall outside the monetary economy. So from a macro perspective, from your perspective, would this be a good idea and one way in which you might start to de-genderize this kind of home labor? Because I have reservations, so I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Then to the panel as a whole, with respect to the intersectional approach you mentioned in the introduction, I wondered if any of the panelists wanted to say a bit more about how intersectionality played into your analysis at all. Other than the person who spoke about age, I wasn't sure what intersectionality was bringing to the analysis, but it could just be me because I'm not a sociologist. Again, sorry.
No problem. It's very multidisciplinary here.
Yeah, true. Very good. And did any of the panelists notice any changes in intergenerational dynamics in the studies that you did? So in other words, the issues that you were covering, have they changed for women and men, say from 50 years ago to now, or was that not part of what you were looking at? But if it wasn't, if you were looking at that, was there anything that you could say on that front? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll just ask for a show of hands. Anybody else have questions before I go on to let people answer? Yes? No? Okay, sorry. Well, anyhow, you can think about it. It's time. So we'll go to you, Barbara, to start with, and then all the panelists, if you want to answer the other two questions on intersectionality. Oh yeah, I forgot about him. We'll get back to him. We'll do the answer. Oops, I don't mean to look at him over there. He's there. David, is that okay? We do the answers and then we have your question? Good. Okay, so Barbara?
I think that's a really great question. I'll tell you, I worry about doing that because as long as we're at a moment in history where women are still doing so much more of the unpaid caring work than men are. Once we put it into the macroeconomic factors of care, I worry that it will slow down, will increase, if you will, gender segregation, that there won't be a pressure for, will relieve the pressure on sort of in making it possible to be both a carer and a worker by doing that, as opposed to normalizing the alternative route, I think, is to normalize the reality that every worker is also a carer. At some, particularly, I love both the generational and the life course talk that we're talking about, because over the life course, people have different, everyone is a carer, whether it's from young children or aging parents or sick spouses. And so I would rather normalize that all paid workers also have a moral as well as a practical responsibility to be carers. And I do think, to answer your second question, that the data on men in family labor, and of course I said, I understand women do far more than an egalitarian share in every country, but the long-term trajectory over time with time use data in both the United States and the comparative European data sets is that women in 2022 still do far more than, on average, than men, but every generation by decade of men do more than the one before. So that the change is slow. Oriel Sullivan is a UK researcher who uses the analogy of drips of water over time, you know, create valleys and change the shape of rock. And that is more, I think, the analogy. So, you know, it's more about trying to make the water go from a drip to a waterfall to change the rock, but the rocks are changing.
I think we saw during the pandemic that men did do a little bit more. However, women did even more still. And so we're going to have to see after the pandemic also whether that changes. And another thing I think we see in the data is that men tend to choose also, like they're doing more, they're doing the groceries more, they're playing with the kids more, but the basic boring chores, they're not apparently doing as much of that. And I think I'd be worried also about underestimation of women's work if we look at, you know, paying people to stay at home or whatever. So I think, as you were a little bit referring to, I think, Barbara, desegmentation of the labor market, having men go into childcare and women go into more male sectors might eventually bring us to some form of better wages. Did other people want to comment on the two questions before we go to David's question, or do we take David's question and then we integrate it all? I think we'll do that. We'll take David, we'll take your question, and then we'll have all the panelists eventually answer your question and the other two on the elements of that were presented first. So, David.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Okay, good. So it's sort of a contextual comment question. Probably most of you are aware that Putin has justified his attack on Ukraine as an attempt to push back against Ukraine's joining the Western corporate globalizing, and I quote, degenerate developments. So my question is whether any of you have noticed any such trends in corporate policies. That is to say, for example, I worked in a corporation for a long time. It was some time ago, more than 20 years ago, but I remember that two of the people promoted to supervisor, I was a blue collar worker, were GLBQ.
If you can
they were gay
conclude your question, because for us to have time to answer.
Okay, but that's the question, whether there seem to be any corporate policies, overall corporate policies, whether in the US or in the West in general, that seem to be unduly biased, unfairly biased toward GLBQ2T rights and privileges.
Okay, so we'll ask people to respond to the questions on intersectionality and intergeneration, and eventually also on David's question. So, go ahead.
Just about intersectionality, maybe the generation, maybe Barrett could answer. Yes, when we talk about intersectionality, we talk about the intersection of different characteristics of people, maybe not in general, but the intersection, but how this intersection can make people more vulnerable. So, for example, if we think about COVID crisis, we know that Black woman with a partner of low class can have more had more problems to afford the prices and the problems. So this is the reason why it's important. It's not only gender. Gender is important, yes, okay, but
my point. I completely understood what you said, and I understand the concept of intersectionality. It was more just how did it play into the studies that were being discussed? Had they looked at because
how we can study this
whether some chapters maybe treat
were there any
that aspect more.
Exactly. Were there any chapters in the book where that came out more, or where it became part of the methodology that was being used? Was it used in all of them?
Yeah, you can use several kind of methodologies, but I think that in some cases qualitative can be better if you come more in depth, but also you can compare situation using also quantitative measures or items, or so. I think that you can go with together. I don't know if you can cite some specific work, because maybe you want to. Okay, so
if you want,
yeah. I don't know about intergenerationality, maybe also Barrett, but
or Anne and Manuela, if you have anything to add.
No, on intergenerational changes, we could say, I think that in my chapter was not touched because it was a cohort group of those who became parents for the first time. And the average age was very close. So of course, we had some over 40 and some that were around 30. And of course, we see some small differences that cannot be generalized in our studies. But I think that some quantitative studies have already shown that there have been important changes in respect to finish the incomplete gender revolution that we know very well in terms of also the things that the moderator was saying, no? In the father that are more involved, of course, the younger father are more involved in the children, not only playing with them. For instance, we have noticed, especially in the younger father, a strong commitment for the very young children. So there have been important changes in that respect. But I think that in that respect, more quantitative research can say more, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add, my thoughts about intersectionality is my main observation was just that it tends to be age tends to be treated as what a colleague Tony Calasanti has called it, the et cetera. Age as an et cetera is captured in that little everything else. But I think that, or we tend to think, okay, that's compartmentalized. That's what I meant about age being, a marginalized topic across, this literature and others in the field. Okay, these are the studies about older adults, instead of, what could be gained by looking at them together, and look, okay, what does this care work involve, for example, at different points in the life course? Why is it structured this way? Why is it valued this way? So those are my thoughts on intersectionality. A couple other thoughts I had in terms of relating to the other questions. Over the life course, I just kind of want to mention that another way to this, I think, is important to still think of, not just, okay, these are different stages of life, but to really think critically about them and think, how age inequality figures into it in terms of which stages get attention, the way we think about work-life balance, the invisibility of the work, visibility of the work, which work deserves state or workplace support, which people deserve support, and those kind of things. So a critical perspective, age as a more critical lens. And in terms of historical shifts, just something to say about that. I think something else that would be that not just in terms of like division of labor, shifts in that, but just, cultural meanings attached to and investments in, attachment in different realms. like leisure and work. I mean, there's been some research showing that each subsequent generation is attaching less, identifying less strongly with work, more with leisure, or valuing it more. So, I mean, those kind of shifts, historical shifts, could be interesting to explore more too.
I just can say something concerning the generational changes, because what we see in general in the studies, both if you look at the quantitative and the qualitative studies, you can find not really a complete changing of the situation, but you can find like a tension at the moment, because, for example, you see in the qualitative studies, what Italy, for example, this study by Naldini, we wrote a book in which you see the fathers that they find themselves like new fathers, and they think they are very involved in taking care of the children. Maybe when you look at the quantitative part, you look at the number of the hour, they are less involved than the mother, and they are more involved, like to say, playing with the baby, but not doing the not very interesting things, but the boring things. But anyway, so you can see in the society some kind of tension. We are in the way of some changing. But the problem is that we have very, according to me, coming from sociology of work, we have very clear defined roles for these situations, and it's difficult to arrive to a new definition of situation and of role. Sometimes you see in the work a lot of changing, because you see that in the majority of new couples, both the parents are working, but they are still in tension, changing their roles. So this is very interesting situation, but is in transition with the file. Thank you for the question.
Okay, did you want to add anything else? No? Well, we're going to conclude. We're pretty much on the time, a few seconds. So thanks a lot for being here, and especially thanks a lot for sharing with us the presentation of the book and having so many of the different authors. That was really very interesting. And I'll invite you all to read this book, as I found it very, very interesting myself. And as you heard, covers many themes. And so I think it can be useful for research, obviously, but also for teaching as well. So thanks a lot for doing the book and for presenting it.
Thank you.